There are things in life that we accept with a crooked smile, like the neighbor who parks a little crookedly, or the dog in front of the house that barks into the wind, as if it were his personal mission to let you know that the air exists. Now, when a woman runs a power cable over your fence as if your socket were a public extension of the city, then it's no longer about patience. It's about judgment, and she had none. It was a hot, dry day, and I was outside tidying up some tools in the shed, when I raised my head and saw that fluorescent orange cable crossing my land like an electric snake trying to camouflage itself in a yellow lawn. It took me a second to process. I thought it was a prank by a bored teenager, but it wasn't. It was real, and it was coming straight from the house of my favorite neighbor, the president of the glorious and authoritarian neighborhood association, whom I avoided like an email from an ex on a Monday morning. I walked slowly to the corner of the wall and confirmed it. The woman had tied the wire with those plastic Christmas ribbons and stuck a little sign on it saying, "Temporary use. Thank you for collaborating with the community." Community, in this case, being just her, because no one else in that condominium would dare to make a gourmet cat of this level of impudence. I stood there for a good few minutes looking at it. The audacity was so great that I even wanted to applaud, but I applauded slowly, sarcastically, like slapping one hand against the other in disgust. She had run the wire through the back fence, where she knew no one would see it right away. The wire came from her balcony, crossed my fence, and went straight down to my shed. More specifically, to the side where my external sockets were. In other words, as well as being invasive, she was creative. You know the kind of people who say they're very involved in the community, but in practice just want to control everyone? She was the spirit of that, in human form. The woman who once forbade children to ride their scooters on the sidewalk, claiming it risked the integrity of the neighborhood. The same woman who wanted to fine the couple in House 14 because they put a hammock on their balcony. "The hammock is not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood," she said, as if hammocks were a federal crime. But this time, she went too far. Because it's one thing for a woman to want to define the color of the garbage cans. It's another to think she can turn on her party's sound equipment using my power, without asking, without telling me, without even pretending to be polite. I went back to the shed, took a deep breath, and sat down on the bench. On the top shelf, there was an old circuit breaker that I had kept since I worked in industrial safety. It was the kind of equipment used in sound resistance tests, heavy factory stuff, the kind that produces engines and leaves people half-deaf for a week if they're not wearing hearing protection. Was it too much to wear that? Absolutely. But you know what else was over the top? A woman throwing a cable into my yard, as if I were the employee of her personal electric company. So I decided to return the exaggeration in kind. I dusted off the circuit breaker, turned it on calmly, and plugged in the end of her extension cord. Simple. No sabotage, no damage, just a harmless noise. Technically speaking, the circuit breaker was programmed to trip when the circuit was closed, and that, as far as I could see, was going to happen at 3 in the afternoon, the time when the HOA staff were meeting for tea and to discuss whether the grass in House 7 was really acceptable green. I went out onto the porch, sat down in the wooden chair, and waited. At 3:02, I heard the dry click of the system arming. A second later, the most deafening sound the neighborhood had ever heard. It sounded like someone had thrown a missile into an iron drum and lit a match. The test siren went off. It was a noise that started out high-pitched, rose like a fighter jet engine taking off, and then dropped to a low pitch that made your chest vibrate. I wasn't exaggerating when I said it was industrial. The sound invaded the entire condominium like a noisy bomb authorized by science, and it was all coming from her living room. I didn't have to go to the window to see the damage. Her scream was enough to imagine the scene. The sound cut through the tranquility, like a hot knife through butter. I saw people opening windows, dogs barking desperately, and an elderly man running with a plate of pies in his hand, thinking it was mandatory evacuation. The woman ran down the sidewalk, her hair in a mess, looking like she'd stepped out of a shampoo commercial during a hurricane. With her cell phone in her hand, she shouted into the phone as if she were talking to the Pentagon. Only this time, the connection was with her own humiliation. She disappeared for a few hours. Literally. After the loud scandal that shook her house from the inside, she disappeared with her car down the back street and never gave another sign. I thought he'd gone to a spa to de-stress his eardrums and massage his bruised ego. But no, the disappearance was a strategy. While the neighborhood was still trying to figure out what had happened, whether it was an alarm, a municipal siren test, an alien attack, or a collective outbreak of noise, I knew exactly what was coming. Because women like that don't swallow their shame. She chews it up, chokes it down, and spits it back out in the form of a police report. By 7 in the evening, the street was quieter. The sun was hiding behind the trees, and the neighbors, still in shock, were whispering on their balconies, reliving the moment when the sound made their windows vibrate. And then she came back. The white SUV paraded down the street with its arrogance intact, as if it had spent the day receiving legal advice and motivational talks. She got out of the car with firm steps, a notebook in her hand, and a look like she was about to found a new country. He walked straight up to my fence, stopped there, and stared. He looked at me as if I were a bandit, a criminal energy of evil. The curious thing was that, even after handing me a cable without asking, I still thought I was the victim in the story. It was amazing how he could invert reality with such conviction. He took out his cell phone and started filming. Of course, part of the ritual. She talked to herself, with the camera in her face, narrating the supposed electrical violation and the irreversible hearing damage caused by a device installed without permission. The best? She tried to sound calm, but you could hear that nervous squeak in the back of her voice, typical of someone who is about to explode for the second time in a day. The next day, the letter arrived. A letterhead envelope with the HOA symbol printed in gold, worthy of a royal wedding. Inside, an official notice. I was being warned for antagonistic behavior, loud intimidation, and misuse of offensive technology in a residential zone. She actually wrote that down. Offensive technology. As if I'd tested a Russian missile in my backyard. I took a deep breath and left the notification on the kitchen table. Next to it, the full incident report was already stacked up, with photos of the cable going through my fence, security camera footage showing her installing the extension cord without permission, and the circuit breaker report, all properly separated for what was to follow. Because the truth is that, unlike her, I wasn't acting on impulse or drama. I knew exactly what I was doing. When I plugged that cable into the circuit breaker, I was absolutely sure of two things. One, that there was no real risk, since the equipment was only calibrated for sound emission. And two, that the power would only be triggered if someone on the other side closed the circuit. In other words, she did it with her own hands. At the end of the week, I got a call. A representative of the HOA board wanted to mediate the situation. Of course, it was just a polite way of saying, "She's giving us such a hard time that we need to pretend we're doing something." They arranged an informal meeting in one of the association's halls. I went along, out of politeness, to register, and because I wanted to see the show up close. I arrived calmly, without a folder, without a speech. On the other side of the table she was already seated, with her paperwork organized in piles and a fountain pen in her hand, as if she were about to sign an international treaty. The representative began in the typical voice of a priest at a funeral. "We are here to seek an amicable solution between neighbors." She didn't wait for him to finish. She stood up, pointed her finger, and started the theater. She said that she ran the cable in a moment of need, that she was without power due to a technical fault, that I should have communicated the risk. She said that the sound caused her an episode of chronic anxiety and that she could no longer sleep. She said her dog wouldn't eat. Her microwave stopped working. Her grandmother fainted. That the peace of the neighborhood was torn apart because of me. The representative tried to interrupt, but she wouldn't stop. It was an avalanche of nonsense, and in the midst of it all, I just watched. I let her finish. Then I took the USB stick with the videos and the technical report out of my pocket and left it on the table. Here are the images of you invading my property with an electric cable, and also the recording of the moment you tripped the circuit breaker. Oh, and there's a technical report showing that the device is within the sound safety limits, used for years by companies for acoustic tests. All documented. She froze. The representative looked at me, then at her, then at the flash drive. The silence that settled there was more powerful than any explosion. For the first time, she had nothing to say. The meeting ended in less than 5 minutes. No conciliation, no retraction, just embarrassment floating in the air like burning smoke. After the meeting, her silence lasted 2 days. And look, 2 days of silence from this woman was practically a miracle. She was the kind of creature who didn't know how to live without a fuss. If she wasn't in the spotlight, she'd invent a problem just to be the star. But this time, she disappeared. No car parade, no voice shouting at the gardener next door, no emails with words in capital letters. But of course that was the breather before the next storm. And it came in style. On Thursday morning, I was woken up by a dry knock on the gate. Firm. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission. I got out of bed, looked out of the window, and saw 2 county officers standing there, one of them with a clipboard. Greetings exchanged, soulless smiles. The script was clear. Formal complaint. They had come to investigate a suspected use of dangerous devices in a residential area. The complaint had been made by a representative of the local community. Of course, it was her. If she had the guts, she'd sign it with lipstick. What she hadn't counted on, and this was clear on the faces of the police officers, was that I had already prepared everything. The security cameras that captured the cable being thrown over the fence, the video of the moment when she touches the socket, the technical reports with all the parameters of the circuit breaker, decibel thresholds, activation time, absence of electrical hazards, and the fact that the circuit was only closed with her direct interference. I showed her everything calmly. No nervousness, no exaggeration. While one of the officers read the documents, the other looked at the video on the tablet with that, "Why are we here watching this?" look. They quickly understood that they were being used as pawns on the board of someone who doesn't know how to lose. One of them looked at me with a tired half-smile and said, "We get a lot of absurd things, but this one makes the top 5 of the year." I replied in the same tone. "The neighborhood has been very creative lately. They left without registering anything. No fines, no recommendations, just a promise to report it in the system as a closed, unfounded case. But the real taste came at the end." One of the officers commented that, when he checked the complainant's history, he found more than 30 records of calls in less than a year. Complaints ranged from birds singing too much to neighbors wearing inappropriate clothing for gardening. The woman was excited about her own power, but without a break, and the break came. The next morning, an official notice from the council arrived in the mailbox. Now, it wasn't for me. It was for her. The HOA was opening an internal investigation for abuse of authority, misuse of the association's name in personal complaints and trespassing. The irony? They used the same images she helped produce. The very video she recorded would become evidence against her. The fluorescent orange cable, the temporary use sign tied with a satin bow, all duly filed and registered. She tried to fight back. As usual, she started a Clean Up the Neighborhood campaign. She put up posters on lampposts with catchphrases like, "Say no to electrical disorder," and "The neighborhood needs quiet and security." He handed out pamphlets printed at home with an inkjet printer, cut crookedly, and with the HOA logo in the corner, as if they were legitimate. But now no one was buying it. Neighbors, who had previously been afraid to face it, began to react. The neighborhood Facebook group turned into a Cold War. Indirect posts, photos of fences with accidental extensions, memes with smiling sockets. Even people who never got involved started to speak out. There was one who put up a banner on the balcony saying, "Here the energy is ours alone, but the noise is everyone's." The funniest thing is that, somehow, the sound bomb became a symbol of resistance. The teenagers, who used to tiptoe around it to avoid attracting attention, now imitated the sound of the siren when they passed in front of her house. Even the delivery man at the market started dropping off the bags with a high-pitched whistle just to provoke her. She sank deeper with every attempt to get back on her feet. And meanwhile, me, quiet, sipping coffee on the porch. The circuit breaker stored back in the shed, the cameras up to date, and the certainty that I didn't have to lift a finger after that first snap. Because people who drown in their own arrogance don't need a push. They just need time. And for her, time was running out. The problem with people who think they're invincible is that when they fall, they make more noise than any circuit breaker plugged into an illegal extension cable. And with this woman, the fall was loud enough to become an urban legend in the neighborhood. After her flyers were picked up by direct order of the HOA board, after the complaint was dismissed with a chuckle from the officers in the internal report, after half the residents completely ignored her existence, she even tried, amazingly, to appeal to the local press. She sent emails to 2 regional newspapers, a neighborhood news blog, and even a podcast about citizenship and harmonious neighborhoods. In all of them, she said that she was being persecuted by a neighbor with shady interests, and that she had been the victim of an intentional acoustic attack for intimidating purposes. The text seemed to have been written by a B-movie scriptwriter, the kind who mixes legal terms with soap opera drama. But nobody took the bait. No serious media outlet was going to put its reputation on the line because of a woman who, in the words of the council itself, spent more energy trying to control the lives of others than looking after her own home. One journalist even replied, "We don't cover fiction based on paranoia." The worst thing for her was the isolation. The kind of punishment that these controlling figures fear the most. The social exclusion, the icy silence, the crossed eyes that avoid contact. She, who used to be the center of meetings, was now barely able to sit on the bench in the square without being whispered at. She became a shadow, an ashamed and increasingly bitter shadow. One day I saw her standing in front of my house, looking at the space where her cable used to cross my fence. She had a tape measure in her hand and a notebook. She stood there measuring, writing, trying, perhaps, to find a gap, but there was nowhere else to stand. The legal ground she thought she was standing on crumbled under her heels. And then came the inevitable, the HOA special meeting. All members and interested residents were summoned. The agenda was straightforward: restructuring the board and evaluating conduct that disrespected the legal limits of coexistence. The woman showed up dressed as if she were the godmother of the event. Pencil skirt, starched white shirt, hair tied up so tight it was painful just to look at. She was carrying a huge briefcase full of papers and arguments. He thought, until the last second, that he would be able to reverse it. But this time, she didn't even finish speaking. She was interrupted by one of the older members, a gentleman who had always been neutral, one of those who watched quietly but observed everything. He stood up, straightened his glasses, and said, "The problem here was never the cable. It was the mania for wanting to be in charge of everything. And you don't own the neighborhood." She sat down. She didn't say anything, not because she didn't have the words, but because she understood that, finally, no one else was willing to listen. The result was unanimous: immediate removal from office, permanent veto of any position within the association, and a formal recommendation for psychological counseling. Yes, that was on paper. Some people applauded, some people laughed, and there were those who just got up and left with a light heart. A few days later, her fence was being painted, not by her, by a hired team. Apparently, she had decided to take a break from the neighborhood. They said she was going to live with a cousin in a nearby town to get her head together. Others say she received a notice from the condominium asking her to leave for public health reasons. We can't know what's true. What we do know is that the silence that followed was blessed. And what about me? I'm still here, with my fence up, my tools up to date, and no extraneous extension cords hanging where they don't belong. The circuit breaker has been put away, but the moral of the story has been nailed down like a warning sign. If you mess with the wrong wire, you'll get a shock, even if it's an audible one. Oh, and a detail. Her dog, the one that was supposedly traumatized. A few days later, I saw him running happily with the kids in the street. He even seemed relieved. I guess it wasn't the noise that was bad for him. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.